Welcome to the Affirming Minds podcast, where we equip like-minded mental health professionals with a therapeutic toolkit that helps add to a more engaging, fulfilled, and effective mental health practice. Each empowering episode can stand alone as a continuing education pod course or a very valuable professional or personal resource with insightful expert interviews, practical resources, industry news, and lots of inspiration. We help the modern therapist thrive at work. Now let's welcome your host, a dedicated therapist and passionate educator, Shayna Cyber, LCSW.
Welcome to the Affirming Minds podcast. I'm your host, Shayna Cyber. If you want to earn continuing education credits for listening to today's episode, consider becoming an Affirm Academy member. Visit affirmmentalhealth.com to learn more and join our community. A quick note before we get started, this podcast is for educational purposes only. The information shared tonight is not a substitute for clinical training or treatment and should not be used to diagnose or treat any individual. If you or someone you know needs mental health support, please reach out to a licensed mental health professional. We deeply value and respect client confidentiality. While we may discuss general themes or concepts from clinical practice, no identifying information about clients is ever shared. Any scenarios or examples mentioned are composites, de-identified, or hypothetical, provided solely to enhance your understanding of today's topic. Now, let's get into today's episode. I'm thrilled to be joined by Anastasia Sfiroudis-Rodriguez, LCSW, a psychotherapist, mental health leader, and trainer based in New York. Anastasia specializes in treating anxiety, perfectionism, and burnout in high achievers and athletes. As a former athlete and recovering perfectionist herself, Anastasia brings a dynamic and empathetic approach to her work, encouraging clients and colleagues to embrace growth and continuous improvement, a value that reflects the name of her practice, Meliora Psychotherapy, which means better things ahead. In her private practice, Anastasia uses acceptance and commitment therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy to help high achievers, students, and athletes build resilience, develop psychological flexibility, and live authentically in alignment with their values. She also serves on the board of the Association of Contextual Behavioral Sciences Social Work Special Interest Group and is pursuing her Certified Mental Performance Consultant certification to deepen her expertise in performance consulting. In this episode, we'll explore the unique factors for burnout athletes and high performers. From relentless training schedules to perfectionism and performance anxiety, we'll share practical, evidence-based strategies grounded in ACT and integrative approaches that can help athletes and high achievers thrive, sustain their performance, and live value-driven lives. There's so many tangible takeaways in this episode, so let's dive in. Anastasia, thank you so much for joining us on the Affirming Minds podcast. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you today. Would you mind sharing with our audience a little bit about yourself and how you became interested in studying burnout and performance in athletes and high performers?
Yeah, absolutely. It's been an interesting journey. I think, like most clinicians, to how I got to this point and how I became interested in this unique population. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and currently pursuing a CMPC, certified mental skills performance consultant accreditation with the Association of Applied Sports Psychology. In addition to having trained a lot in things like ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, motivational interviewing, trauma-focused CBT. So that's some clinical background. I currently own and operate solo private practice called Meliora Psychotherapy in New York and in licensed in New York State as well as Massachusetts. And aside from that, I am also the Senior Director of Compliance, QA, Risk Management, and Training and Development for a pretty large behavioral health nonprofit in New York City.
What sparked some of this curiosity specifically with athletes and high performers? What sort of got you curious about that specific population?
Yeah, so I, as a kind of child and adolescent, was not an athlete. When I was actually an undergrad, I started working for an MMA gym, right? Kind of happenstance. I had a friend that was working there. They needed somebody to sell memberships. I needed to make money. I was like, sure. When I started working at this gym, they were like, listen, if you're going to work here, like you should probably work out here and know the product that you're selling. So I had never done any like MMA. I'd never really been an athlete. When I started training and started working out, like it was really a challenge, right? But then I started to really fall in love with that challenge. And then next thing you know, as a person now in my early 20s, I started to compete for the first time and competed on a national stage in Muay Thai. And I've done Brazilian now for, I don't know, 15 plus years. Met my husband at the gym. Classic love story there. He actually owns and operates a MMA gym in Merritt, Long Island called Cowboy Thai Boxing and Brazilian Jiu Jitsu Academy. So while I was in this community, I've met incredible people in this community, but so much of this community, there are these mental barriers. Half of the game is mental. Getting into a ring, you can have the best physical training, the best coaches, but something happens when you get into a ring, when you compete, when you have to actually perform. And so I would see these incredible people that I was training with, and I had that experience too. You do all the right things, all the inputs are correct, you control for everything, and then it becomes time to perform, and something happens. Like all of the training, all of the work that you had put in, all of a sudden now you forget it and you just go straight into fight or flight. And I've had this personal experience in the ring, right? You perform beautifully in practices, all of this stuff. And then it comes time to jump in the ring and you just shut down and lose everything. I think a lot of people can relate to that. But having gone through that experience, seeing my peers go through that experience, they all had a lot of questions like, how do I get over these mental hurdles, right? Through my own practice, my own training, my own experience, I was like, I got to get through this. I got to figure this out. And I was my own first client in that way. Started learning things for myself, started learning all these mental skills, mindfulness, visualization. How can I do these to get me into a state of flow, be able to control like the outcomes of all the work I was putting in? And then people would start asking me, hey, you're a therapist, right? What do I do to get this mental game in order? So I start giving them little tidbits here and there. Try this visualization, try this guided breathing activity, try and do some of the CBT work, like all of these things. And I found it really beneficial. In addition to that, when I was getting my LCSW, I was working in an outpatient clinic, Forest Hills in Queens, New York. And I was working with a lot of adolescents at that point and a lot of adolescent boys. And a lot of the kids I was working with were high school and college athletes. And so they were coming in for things like depression or impulse control disorders or anger, all of these things that they were coming in for to be clinically treated. But then they were also feeling these same issues in their athletic performance because a lot of them were baseball athletes, football athletes, basketball athletes. And so it became an opportunity to translate some of these things that I had used and leveraged in my personal life, in my own hobbies and interests, and be able to translate it to clinical application. These college, high school athletes that were coming in with the anxiety and the anger and the impulsivity and all the things that happen at that stage of life.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's so interesting. And I really love that sort of you going through this embodied practice, your own sort of passion developing, and then getting that itch for competing and this skills implementation through the process of doing and actually organically building this community and recognizing the unique mental health needs is like a really, I think, interesting story. And while certainly not an athlete on my end, I feel like I strive to be a high achiever and surrounded by a lot of high achievers, and that performance anxiety that you're describing, where some of the things you're hitting on is that Do you think they're just like hobbies or interests, these things that become really centered in a high achiever's life, whether that be an athlete or another form of a high achiever? Is it so like identity level that it becomes so tied to who someone is? These sort of areas where they're striving for achievement or having to perform or compete. I imagine there's so much that gets tied into that on a psychological level in terms of their beliefs about themselves, about their worth, their value, as well as some of those practical things you were talking about related to like visualization, behavioral reversal, all of those things. One of the things that you mentioned as we started to plan that is your sort of focus on flow states and burnout
Yep.
in this population. Would you mind sharing with our audience a little bit about that connection between flow states and burnout and what you're finding with sort
Yeah.
of athletes and high achievers?
Yeah, certainly. And to be clear, like a lot of the stuff when we're talking about performance psychology, there's a lot of crossover between athletes and high achievers. Because at the end of the day, whether your performance is in a ring at a specific game or your performance is in a boardroom in front of either peers or executives negotiating, leading a team, it is all still performance based. And so flow and burnout become really interesting concepts for this particular population of folks, right? When you're a high achiever, there's usually a lot of drive. Like you talked about identity. And so values, right? How your identity is intertwined with those achievements, those outputs is incredibly important for athletes and high achievers. And so what was interesting is like I was seeing these kids, I was seeing all of these athletes like in the clinic. I was seeing the people at my gym who were incredible. Some of them are professional combat sports athletes, but their sense of self would vacillate so frequently based on their last performance because there's so much shame often that's brought into this space that you measure yourself on how good did I do at the last thing, right? How good did I do at that last board meeting, right? How well did I articulate myself? Did I get the goal that I had intended? Or did I win? Did I win the competition or did I lose? And so your value becomes so much measured by did I win? And sometimes there is an actual win, right? You have a competition. At the end of the competition, somebody's hand gets raised. You know very clearly, I won or I didn't. Sometimes, though, it's not that clear. So if you have, for example, those high achieving professionals that are in a negotiation, the perception of winning, did I get my point across? If they don't get everything that they want, I'm negotiating a big contract, right? Or trying to leverage something professionally for me. If I don't get everything that I want, there becomes this black and white thinking pattern, right? Where I didn't win. That must mean my value is really low. I'm not as good as I think I am. And all of a sudden, you have people that would come in, and one week would be like, I'm on top of the world. I won. And then the next week come in and be like, I am the worst person in the world. I'm not worth anything. I'm never going to be successful. And I'm sitting back going, what's going on here? Like, how are we going from these extreme poles? And there's no clinical indication for some kind of like bipolar disorder or mania here. This was all perception of self and identity. And so that's where flow and burnout come in. Because burnout, the way that I see it is burnout and flow are opposite ends of the same human performance spectrum, right? On the high end, on the ideal end, we've got flow, which is this state of being fully present in the moment, performing in the way that you want to. There's absorption, right? You lose track of time. It's like the world is just, you're in a bubble. Have you ever had that feeling before where you're like in the thick of something? Your mind is clear, you're perfectly dialed in, and you just feel like you're on fire. Like everything is firing on all cylinders. That's flow. Burnout, on the other hand, is everything is getting in the way. I can't focus. I'm fully exhausted, cynical, right? Hating everything and can't get anything done. I feel like I'm completely paralyzed by my exhaustion and my cynicism.
In an athletic person, a person where sports and performance are so central, where they're pretty vulnerable to teetering between those two states, and that it must be frustrating being out of that flow state where they really can not just perform their best, feeling more like alive, connected, vital, um, in their sport where they're totally in their head and preoccupied in a way that takes away maybe those feelings of pleasure, purpose, or connection, or teamwork, or whatever might feel like relevant in that moment for them, makes it meaningful for them. So absolutely. Can you
I mean,
explain? Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, no, go ahead. No, I was saying that's just why values are so important when it comes to this. And that's why I really love to act for this population because it, you need to find the driver, why somebody is investing so much effort, time, resources into something. Again, whether that's sport or that's a career, or I've had performers that are musicians, dancers, gymnasts. Performance can be a variety of things, actors. But you need to find that why, what's driving them to invest so much.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Could you explain to our audience the Yerkes-Dodson law, and how that applies to optimizing performance without tipping into to burnout?
Yeah, for sure. So, in a psychological concept that was first published in like 1908, so like really old concept that's been cited, I don't even know, probably tens of thousands of times since it was originally published. But Yerkes-Dodson looks at what's the relationship between arousal or stress, right, and performance. And so there's this inverted U relationship. If you look at the Yerkes-Dodson kind of graph on the kind of far left end, you've got low arousal, low stress. And then you also have low performance, right? Think about it for yourself. If you've got a task that you've got to do, or if you're going to a place where you're not really invested, you're checked out, right? You don't really care about the outcomes here. What's the thing that's propelling you to perform? What is the thing that's going to get you going, that's going to motivate you to show up as your best self, as that prime kind of peak self? If there's no, what they talk about in Yerkes-Dodson is arousal or stress, right? Then there's no motivators, there's no drivers to try. So in the middle of Yerkes-Dodson, we've got what we call like the ideal stimuli and setup for performance. There is just enough kind of stress or arousal for you to perform ideally. And what that also looks at is what is the actual demands of the performance. So if we're talking about something like a competition, right? If you're a high school level athlete, then the ideal situation is I'm going to go into a meet that's at a division, right? That is commensurate with like my experience level, my skill level. But if I go into a competition where it's like, oh, I'm a high school athlete that's competing against college athletes, then the demands far exceed my skill level. I'm not going to perform well. So in Yerkes-Dodson, we want the ideal amount of arousal in order to produce outcomes. And then on the far end of Yerkes-Dodson, if we've got too much stress, too much arousal, then we've got anxiety. Essentially, we've got crash, we've got burnout. And so that's what the inverted U is. On the low end, I don't have enough motivation to actually perform. Right in the middle, that's where we peak, right? We've got just the right amount of stress in order to perform ideally. And then on the other end, we've got way too much stress, way too much. So we've got anxiety and I completely shut down. that fight flight.
Yeah. And when you're talking about this stress, are you talking about all these internal private experiences in terms of their beliefs about stress, how physiology is showing up in their body? Or are we also talking about like how the coach or the parent, we see these things on YouTube, people fist fighting at their 7-year-old soccer games, or they're incredibly toxic cultures where people are forced to maybe engage in restricted diets or really
Oh, yeah.
stay physical practices to prep for competitions and things like that. So is there any explicit kind of speaking to internal, external stressors in this model?
So your case is just like arousal performance relationship, right? But that original psychological concept has been cited, like I said, in tens of thousands of other publications looking at its application in a variety of areas. And when we're talking about Yerkes thoughts and in relation to sport, to answer your question shortly, yeah, all of those things that can induce stress can be those internal stimuli, but it can also be the external stuff, right? And so that's why we need to try and control for the controllables and also be mindful and be willing to let go of the things that are outside of our control. And for a high performer with those unrelenting standards and that belief that I can and have to do everything, letting go of some of the external stuff is incredibly challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. So are there some unique red flags for burnout that you've observed in athletes specifically?
So, in athletes, burnout, one of the key elements of burnout, like Maslow is one of the key researchers on burnout. And originally, burnout was applied to like workplace burnout specifically. But now, again, that concept has been applied to a variety of other areas. And so, one of the elements of burnout syndrome, which also you probably know is an ICD, that I think it was published first in ICD 10 or ICD 11 as an actual standalone disorder. One of the qualifiers of that is cynicism. And so an athlete, something that I'm always perking my ears up for, a performer, something that I'm perking my ears up for, is the devaluation of the sport, the career that they love, right? And have invested so much into. And so when I start to hear these like moans and groans of cynicism happen, I'm like, what's going on here? Is this just a bad day? Or are we going to a place where we're going to burn out?
Absolutely. I think it was really interesting talking about the flow state, and I certainly can recognize with myself like when I'm in the flow state, when I'm working or performing or whatever the case may be. Can we support people in getting into flow state more frequently for longer durations of time? What are your thoughts on that? Like about through therapy, how we can support clients in amplifying their experiences of being in flow state.
So I love this question. I really do, because I think so many people, particularly these high achieving folks who have these unrelenting standards beliefs, they are asking that question all the time. So many times people will come into my virtual office, but will come in and be like, okay, right, how do I make that happen? How do I just eliminate all of the negative thoughts, all the procrastination, all of the distractions, right? And I'll often joke with people and be like, yes, okay, now's the time, right, where you take the magical journey, you travel to the top of the mountain, right, you drink from the lotus flower, and all of a sudden, you'll just be gifted with the ability to be in flow. And of course not. Like, that's not the reality. There is no kind of magic pill, right, to be able to get into a flow state at any time that you want. There are ways to try and prime for flow. You know, what are those psychological correlates to be able to get into a flow state? And that's what we really try and work on. Flow is really interesting, but there's also a really harsh reality with flow that just like with sleep and other psychological challenges, where the more that we fixate on it, the more we try and contrive and control it, the harder it becomes to actually engage it.
Yeah, absolutely. When we, talk, I think we'll start talking specifically about the way you're using ACT with this population, which I think is
Yeah.
really wonderful application. But this idea of our urge to force emotions and just the futility of that and the limitations of that, classic actively, okay, fall in love with the next person as if we can just snap our fingers and generate an internal private experience out of the abyss. And to make that happen, we can just turn on wanted emotions, and how that, as you were saying, keeps you stuck, makes it more elusive, makes it more out of grasp in many ways. Perhaps this is a good time to kind of transition a little bit about how you're using ACT, and if you could share any sort of ACT-based interventions you found particularly effective in addressing burnout in high performers.
Yeah, certainly. I adore ACT. Acceptance commitment therapy has been really at the core of a lot of my practice. And I find it's incredibly effective with this population for a variety of reasons. When it comes to ACT, we've got the 6 core processes, we've got acceptance, right? Diffusion, selfless context, mindfulness. Um, what am I missing here? Committed action. Thank you. And so we've got the 6 core processes, right? And so how do we prime for flow? We actually first have to look at some of those core processes to be able to get psychological flexibility. Like you were talking about before, right? A lot of the shoulds, that internal world, we try and really control for those emotional states, right? We start to judge, right? What our internal monologue, inner critic starts saying about our performance, about ourselves, right? And a lot of times those emotions, instead of just noticing them and being able to identify them for what they are, they're just emotions, right? They're not facts. Really challenging for folks to see emotions for what they are. They're just emotions. And so often there's a great ACT protocol actually called the flexible mind that looks at how to apply ACT to athletes and athletic populations. And within that, there's an acronym called TEAM, right? Treat emotions as messengers. That's it. Emotions are just trying to provide us a message, a cue about what our internal or external experience is. And we can notice them, be able to identify the message, but we don't have to do anything else with them, right? So treat emotions as messengers. That's a really powerful kind of basic tool for people to start to build that awareness and try and create the distance, right, between themselves and the emotion that's coming up. Because then oftentimes what happens is we have the emotion. So we've got the anxiety that pops in, the worry, the disappointment, the frustration that pops in. And then when we're in the middle of a performance, we're negotiating, we're talking, we're competing, we're practicing. Not only do we have the emotion, but then we've got the emotion about our emotional state. We've got the meta emotion. "Ah, why am I feeling frustrated right now? I shouldn't be doing that. I'm trying to get into flow. This isn't helping me right now. I shouldn't. Should. A lot of those shoulds I hear also.
So I think that is like using that team as like a refrain when you're feeling intense, unwanted, or painful, distressing emotions, and letting that be the guide to what is this emotion trying to tell me, or how is it trying to guide me, and or do I just have to like may speak through it and not take action on every emotion that I'm curious about what you find in terms of injury or just over trading. I'm not working with this specific population, but I do work with a lot of high achievers that do things like marathon
Mhm.
training, or even in their life that is hobbies, they become quite competitive and on things like that. And I have had to work through with clients who trying to work like really push their bodies physically. Sometimes when they have fractures or injuries that require surgeries or things like that. So I imagine in this population, it's something that comes up of people who are in that like kind of drive mode all the time. And
Mhm.
like what does it look like in terms of allowing themselves to rest, allowing themselves to recover, allowing themselves to heal? So I'm curious what you found in terms of that, like, how does recovery come into the clinical conversation for people who are really focused on excelling?
Have you ever heard the phrase, the way you do anything is the way you do everything?
Okay.
And that I feel is exactly what we're talking about here, right? Those folks that are high achievers, of course, they're not just high achievers in their professional lives or their academic lives, right? They're not just the folks that are pursuing the PhD or the next promotion. They're also the people that are doing the ultra marathons and are like doing all of these other extracurriculars to try and achieve everywhere in their lives. And so a lot of times when it comes to recovery, it's almost, yeah, recovery is great, but that's not something I need, right? It's this belief that I intellectually or logically know that recovery is important, but not necessarily for me. It's good for everybody else.
Right. Yeah, that's for other people, not for me. And it's just so interesting because I think that's like the way that processes like shame and self criticism also operate, even if it's coming more from a place of exceptionalism, right? Oh, yeah, this rule that I have to work through this painful injury applies to me. It wouldn't apply to my teammate that I'm friends with. It would to my brother, but of course it applies to me. I think that sort of fusion with these rigid thoughts, again, I love that there is this ACT protocol you mentioned for preference because it feels like it does probably map so nicely with some of those inflexible.
Fusion is a big thing, by the way. And I'm happy you brought up the shame because that kind of shame story is so consistent in these high achievers, right? And there was one person I was working with specifically, it was so interesting. He would actually talk about his shame battery. A lot of his achievement was motivated or driven, especially earlier on in life, by that shame because it became something, or this shame button gets pushed, right? I have to react against it. I have to overcompensate for it, and the only way I'm going to do that is to prove it wrong or prove them wrong, whoever the them was, the person that he felt was judging him.
It's interesting too because I'm sure people find their sport in all different ways. And you telling the story of how you got into MMA first, it was like you happened upon it, whereas like a professional opportunity. And it sounds like I imagine that's not the story of everyone, particularly who maybe were introduced to their sport early on in childhood, have been doing it since they're like 3 or 4. Are you ever doing this work and find like when you really do some of this values clarification that the person might just hate their sport and it might predate any sort of performance based burnout?
All the time. All the time. There are people that just didn't know life or don't remember life before sport, before profession, before the pursuit of whatever. Fill in the blank here. And so for them, it's like this cognitive dissonance and the fusion piece of it, where it's like those rules, the rigidity. This is all I know, right? I can't imagine a world, a life outside of this because I'm hanging on to it so dearly. This fuels all of the positive aspects of my identity, my community. It fills so many needs that I can't imagine what my life would look like without it. And yet it brings me so much pain and suffering. When people lose sight of those values and those needs that are being met by the sport or the achievement are not coming close to the pain and the suffering that the sport or the achievement is causing them, we start diving deeply into the burnout. And the really interesting thing about burnout, when you look at stages of burnout, is initially when burnout starts to set in, those like initial cynicism, the devaluation, right? What folks do, and this again is something that's consistent with all the models of stages of burnout, is there's this need for people to control for it. I don't like the cynicism. I don't like these thoughts and feelings that are coming up, that the rules that I've created for myself, this life, this identity, I know where I'm an athlete. I don't know myself any other way. Instead of just noticing it, naming it, reflecting upon it, doing the values clarification work, instead, there's that experiential avoidance. Like, I don't like that. I don't like that feeling that's coming up. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to work harder. I'm going to do more hours in the gym. I'm going to work even harder, be harder on myself. Right. And so there's this response of, I'm going to do more. And that's consistent with our burnout models. There's this initial phases, right? People overcompensate, combat against all of the negative feelings instead of just looking at them for what they are, just thoughts, just feelings. And you know what? I can use that choice point model to either move away or towards whatever's important to me, but I'm in control.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that piece of opening up that there is choice, right? When you're saying like when someone identifies so deeply as an athlete that in their community, their cultural norms and their day-to-day habits, perhaps their livelihood is rooted in that,
Yep.
you know, maybe I just don't want to do this at all. How scary that might be and how no, I'll just get better and I'll like it more. I'll just be more successful and I'll like it more. I see this all the time at said. And just like
Mhm.
having that self as content versus context comes in when being able to say, perhaps I'm a human being that's been practicing medicine, has gone through residency, has gone through fellowship, attending, and I don't want to do this. Like I've done all the things in with force trying to get myself to be this in a way that feels fulfilling and meaningful, and it doesn't. And I think it is one of those really painful pieces to unpack. Just getting to somebody to say there is a choice here, right? Continuing on in this path is a choice, even if they decide I don't like this choice, but I'm choosing it. I think that can be in itself, it can be um huge because I think there is such a feeling of a lack of freedom, a lack of choice, like force that drives a lot of this burnout. I do this because I
Yeah.
have to, not because I want to. And it's an endless feeling to it.
Yeah. And don't you find with those folks, though, that there's like this lack of acceptance around like the situations at hand? Like, I chose medicine. There are these rigid rules. I'm fused to this self as content, right? This is all I know. And are you willing to open up to maybe there's an alternative here? There's a lack of acceptance around that. I remember I was talking to somebody and there was this conversation. And it was like, what if, right? Let's be in an alternate universe, right? For 5 seconds. And let's say that we could change these things for you. And they were like, but what if I don't want to accept that? Right. There was like, all right, this is the situation at hand. This is the confines. Right? This is the cost of being an athlete. This is the cost of my performance. This is the cost on my family, on my time, right? On my personal wellness, on my rest and recovery, like all of these things. This is the cost of being an athlete. This is the cost of being a high performer. Is the cost worth the reward? And I'm having this one conversation with somebody where they're like, what if I don't want to accept that? What if I don't want to accept the cost? What if I just want to continue to avoid it and pretend that those costs aren't there?
Yeah.
And that's so hard for people to accept the certain costs and realities of this achievement that they either have or want to pursue.
So I want to talk maybe a little bit about the societal or cultural pressure around sports and athletes. And I'm sure this happens at all different levels when you're talking about MMA and competitions. I think that's probably a very close knit subculture that can happen on a local level, a regional level, and on. But even when we think about these big sports franchises, people like lighting cars on fire after their sport teams loses, sometimes after they win, like just so much heightened emotion. I'm just even thinking about my husband. Well, we know when the Knicks are playing, we got to be prepared for anything because his mood is just going to take a dive in the gutter, depending if they win or lose. There's such an intense culture around sports and at every level. Can you talk through how societal pressures and this culture of expectation and excellence impacts burnout rates amongst athletes?
Yeah, certainly. So when it comes to expectations and culture, it's a really great question. I've worked with athletes and performers across so many different sports and performance platforms, right? The culture of each individual sport is so different and unique. When you're talking about combat sports versus golfers and baseball athletes, football athletes, basketball athletes, gymnasts, dancers, every single sport and performance arena is its own little cultural microcosm that has its own set of rules and norms. Athletes are acutely aware of what those expectations are based on that community. And they vary widely, right? I obviously love combat sports because that is something that is near and dear to my heart, very much a part of my life, right? But there's a lot of work to be done there. There's so much kind of stigma and so much toxicity that is a part of the culture of that sport. And so many people are still stuck in this belief that, no, it's all physical, there's no mental. It's really hard for people to overcome that and to admit that there is a mental component to that game. Other sports like baseball, golfers, tennis, NFL, sports psychologists and CMPCs are widely available, accepted as a part of the athlete's support team, just like you would have a physical therapist, sports doctor, right? Sports psychologists and CMPCs are a part of that support network, whereas other sports like combat sports, they're a little bit behind still on that. And there's a lot of ego that gets in the way.
Yeah, absolutely. I just think about like how transformative and unfortunately like controversial, like some of what Simone Biles has done for spotlighting the importance of mental health, highlighting the importance of rest and recovery in terms of competing at the highest of high levels. When that just like how brave she had to be to communicate this and got like, an incredible amount of backlash. I think now there's been like sort of resounding support now that she's performed so incredibly well at the most recent Olympics. But prior to that, I feel this outcry about her choices to prioritize her mental health, she was really demonized. Your thoughts about sort of cultural shifts that you hope are embraced more broadly in sports? Is there anything that you think would be important in facilitating some of that change? The sports or communities that are doing it well, do you any insights in how that culture that sort of centers mental health treatment into sort of the conditioning and training, how does that happen?
Yeah. So when it comes to that, I think you're right. People are not always empathetic to the experience of performers for a variety of reasons. And there is this belief that you chose this, right? You wanted to be an athlete. Like, I'm here as a spectator. I want to be entertained. And so sometimes there can be that lack of empathy. And athletes are aware of that. Performers are aware of that. It can be a very isolating experience for them. And so, one thing that we haven't talked much about, but like in treatment, a lot of times we talk about process oriented goals versus product oriented goals. How can an athlete, how can a performer focus on the process versus the product? How do we not just focus on winning necessarily, but how can we fall in love with and set goals around mental health on the process? Meaning, like, how do I reduce my anxiety? How do I create pre-performance routines? How do I prime for those flow states, right? How do I prioritize rest and recovery and be able to tune out some of the external influences because the external influences become those inner critics for folks, right? It becomes that little monster in your ear that's telling you all the negative things and reinforcing all the negative beliefs about yourself. The other thing I want to say in terms of how I think we can start to move the needle on being able to prioritize mental health in our athletes and performers, right? And garner more empathy is top down. These systems that are in place, right? The people that are in power, the people with the money, the people with the resources, the people in charge, right? They need to set the tone. They need to tell the public, right? They need to tell their athletes mental health is important. And so it's hard because these companies, these organizations, a lot of times their priorities are how do we get more viewership? How do we get more sponsorship? How do we build more revenue? And the reality is that you don't have a product unless you've got athletes. And you don't have athletes if they don't have decent mental health.
Right. Right. Absolutely. What are some of the challenges in implementing these interventions on the organizational or coaching level? Maybe thinking about something that's maybe not in terms of mental health treatment, but protective in terms of mental and brain health in the NFL. Some of the difficulties in implementing getting people to wear protective equipment that safeguards against CTE. It seems like everybody should be invested in people not having organic brain decay that can lead to gross negative impacts on someone's physical, mental health that there's so many examples now that it's resulted in suicide and violence. And even something like that, it sounds like it's been hard to get buy into and then implement it even to players participating. I'm curious for you, what do you see as some of the challenges in implementation in organizations and coaching? You mentioned just the priorities being in viewership and spectatorship. Is that sort of the bottom line that carries through? Are there other issues that make it challenging?
Yeah, there's a number of things I think, and I can't speak obviously for some of these larger organizations. So this is my kind of opinion based on my experience. And I think it's really coming from a place of being an advocate for a lot of the athletes that I have worked with and the high performers that I have worked with who felt like needs for safety, right? Psychological safety as well as physical safety were unheard or unmet. These are the kind of voices that I hope to be more of an advocate for, and also want to be fair that I haven't necessarily sat in those rooms, sat at that table to have the conversations to know why decisions about not prioritizing safety gear or not prioritizing athletic safety was made. So I want to be fair. I really do because I don't know why some of those decisions were made. But to answer your question, I think again, like the priorities need to shift. And I think even as like consumers of some of this stuff, And this even comes when it comes to high performers, when you're talking about people in corporate environments, for example, as consumers of these things, right? It's not just the product, there are people behind this product, right? And so, how can we be good humans? How can we really honor and treat these folks as more than just a way to see an entertainment or a performance, but be able to prioritize their safety, their needs, because we want to be invested in these folks for the long term. We want to see them be athletes for as long as they possibly can. We don't necessarily want them to burn out or have some kind of physical injury, right?
Well-being as a prioritized value in these different settings.
Yeah, certainly. And when it comes to like coaches and organizations that are sponsoring these people or colleges with those athletes, kind of college level athletes, which is really interesting now, some of the conversations around college athletes and should they be paid? How are they paid? But one of the things that I'm thinking about is like these bigger structures, these systems that these folks operate in. How do they prioritize athletes' health and wellness that top down? How do they make that a priority? There's so much investment. Think about it at work, and plenty of research has been done on the organizational psychology front when it comes to staff retention, for example. Think about all the resources, all the money, all of the time that's invested into a new employee when they come into a company, how many hours, dollars, etc. Your goal when you hire somebody is you want to retain them for as long as possible. So that way you don't lose out on that initial investment when you are onboarding them. Why is it different for an athlete or a high performer? You invest so much in like training, skilling up this person, getting them adopted into the culture, the infrastructure, all of that. Wouldn't you want that athlete to be in that athletic career with you, your organization, for as long as possible? Instead of neglecting those psychological needs, those physical needs, and then having another seat to fill where you have to invest that many more resources, right, in a shorter amount of time.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Do you think that's another barrier that may be part of the culture now is an idea that people age out of a sport, that there's a a time I do work with a fair amount of people that were like former gymnasts. And I feel like this happens
Hmm.
a lot. There's a period where there are still very young people and they're considered geriatric in this community. Um, I do think also that sort of perpetuates a shame is that their physical stamina, some of which is tied to youth and vitality that we don't have control of. Certainly, there's ways through rest recovery to prolong that period and make it more sustainable. And being with and acknowledging we're human beings in bodies that will age and like our sort of understanding of our mortality and our vulnerability. I'm curious how that you find that plays into some of the mental health issues around performers and high achievers.
Yeah. I find it plays out one of two ways. One is either people are acutely aware of the timeline, right? And they're like, okay, I'm this age. I've got X amount of time before I really age out of this. And it is funny because sometimes you're talking to a 20-year-old who's okay, this is my prime. I've got 5 more years and then I'm done. And then you've got the other end of the spectrum where it's like, I can't imagine a world outside of this and like that experiential avoidance. Like, I just don't even want to start to think about it. And sometimes it's at a detriment, specifically when we're talking about the folks that are starting to age out and there are higher risks of things like injury, for example, for those folks. And there is that like neglect to self care in that way. And a propensity to put yourself at higher risk for injury, for all of those things when those folks are older. It's like a neglect kind of
Yeah.
component there.
Right. It's like having so much urgency that protecting one's body and for more a long-term like humanistic, just like caring for oneself gets disregarded of I have to max out my time in this sport where I have it that's sort of thinking.
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. And they were like, okay, I know that I'm twilighting here, so I just have to be all in. And it's reckless in those moments because they do so much overexert, neglect things like recovery, and then put themselves at risk.
Right. Right. Can you share a success story or maybe a memorable experience that you've had working with an athlete or high performer who has worked through some of these burnout experiences and you're seeing more resilience in a more sustainable way from them?
Yeah, sure. So I'll give you a couple, two that really come to mind, totally different types of stories. But one was actually somebody who had come to me after they had left their kind of performance world. They were a musician, kind of child prodigy type, who really was just incredible and had the potential to be a really brilliant musician, well beyond their years early on in life, right? What had happened though, this person had come to me as an adult. They were more of like an executive level role and had come to me for anxiety related to professional experiences in their adult life. And so during the initial kind of assessment, of course, this musical prodigy background came up and we started to talk through what happened to that. What happened to that musical career that you had? And what had happened was they were so traumatized by that experience. As they had gotten older, the stakes had gotten higher, the level of achievement and performance had gotten higher, that they started to get really severe performance anxiety and started to freeze up and paralyze on stage. And we're hearing such negative criticism from their kind of sphere of influence, their parents, their music teachers, that they just abandoned music entirely for 10 years. And then when they had come to me, which again, they had come to me for anxiety related kind of work stuff, we started to work through some of the burnout that they were experiencing at work. What was really interesting was that part of being able to recover from burnout professionally also meant having to go back and revisit the burnout they experienced with music, having to really find some acceptance, self compassion for what they had been through as a child and then adolescent and early adult, and why they chose to leave. Because what they didn't realize was they were repeating the same cycle in a professional career now as they had in music. All of those unrelenting standards, the experiential avoidance, the beliefs that like recovery are for other people. I don't slow down. I can't slow down. We're showing up again now in their professional life as an executive. And so we had to go back and resolve and fall back in love with like music, right? It's interesting because they went from um, not playing music in like 10, 15 years to actually recording some instrumentals for a friend on a country music album just recently, a couple of months ago. Actually, I don't even know if it was released yet, but they just produced a country music album, and this particular client had done some of the instrumentals on it. And it was such a kind of parallel process for them where they were able to heal from that childhood experience with music and performance and really be able to garner that acceptance and self compassion, right? Now in their present life and have been able to apply that to a workplace and really reduce that anxiety where they're not having the same level of panic all the time, right? They're not coming up with that cynicism, that dread. It's starting to really be less rigid, be more flexible, and accept those emotions and thoughts for what they are.
Yeah, absolutely. That's beautiful. Find it again in a way that feels more connected to where the person is now, away from more of a place of meaning for them. So that's really wonderful.
And there was a lot of avoidance, right? Like the rigidity, the rules, like that was one of those people I was like, no, I don't want to accept any of this. Actually, I have another person that I had worked with who combat sports athlete, much quicker story, more of a classic story. He'd show up in practices and he'd crush it, right? He'd do sparring and he would just absolutely crush it. And then he would show up in the ring and he would freeze. He'd be totally paralyzed. Like lights are on, nobody's home, right? And so that was really hard for him. And so he came to me because he was like, I don't get it. Like I'm sparring, I'm practicing, I'm basically like sparring is you're contriving the environment of being in a competition, but it's not the competition. It's like in your own gym. And I'm crushing it there. But then when it's actually time to perform and I'm in a competition, like I can't wake up. What's going on here? And so we actually did a lot of like exposure type work, like imaginal exposure and values based exposure work. And that really got him going, right? We were able to contrive the environment through exposure based exercise activity. And then he ended up winning a national title. So that was a really big accomplishment.
So, what is one piece of advice you'd give to someone that's currently struggling with burnout in a high performance setting? Yeah. What is one piece of advice you'd give to someone who's currently struggling with burnout in a high performance setting? Like someone who's going through this now, what would you advise them to start, or maybe what should they start thinking about or practicing that may be helpful to start looking at this?
I always advise people start with values. Like you need to understand what those drivers are, why you're investing so much of your life, time, energy, resources into this thing. If there isn't that why behind it, if those values aren't strong and clear, you've got nothing else. So start there. Figure out what your values are and what you want to move towards. And then we can start to adjust the other stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I mentioned when we were applying that one of the things that has really piqued my interest is like incorporating ACT and compassion focused therapy for burnout, having something that pulls you because so much about burnout is about avoiding like unwanted experiences. And if it's like your whole life, this something that's so crucial to your life becomes about not feeling certain feelings or or having certain experiences, not feeling like a failure, not feeling rejected, um, it's gonna just push you into that shutdown and virtual avoidance behavior. I think that critical upfront values work is so essential. Thank you so much. This is such a wonderful conversation. Can you tell our listeners where they can find you and learn more about this important work that you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So my practice website is Meliora Psychotherapy.com. Also follow me on Instagram, which is the pursuit of better therapy. Meliora is actually Latin for the pursuit of better. So that's where the practice name comes from. So yeah, check out my website, Instagram, LinkedIn. Also, if anybody wants more information on ACT, Academy for Contextual Behavioral Sciences, has some awesome resources for sport and performance related psychology. And the Association for Applied Sports Psychology also has some great stuff on there if clinicians or practitioners are interested in getting more resources.
Amazing. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining our community on the Affirming Minds podcast. If you loved this episode as much as we did, please follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts and share it on your socials. If you want more information about how this podcast can add to your continuing education credits, visit affirmmentalhealth.com. And remember, let's affirm, heal, and grow together.